الأنصار عن فاطمة الزهراء عليها السلام بنت رسول الله قال سمعت فاطمة أنها قالت دخل علي أبي رسول الله في بعض الأيام فقال السلام عليك يا فاطمة فقلت عليك السلام قال إني أجد في بدني ضعفا فقلت له أعيذك بالله يا أبتاه من الضعف فقال يا فاطمة ائتيني بالكساء اليماني فغطيني به فأتيته بالكساء اليماني فغطيت به وسرت أنظر إليه وإذا وجهه يتلألأ كأنه البدر في ليلة تمامه وكماله اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد فما كانت إلا ساعة وإذا بولد الحسن قد أقبل وقال السلام عليك يا أمه فقلت وعليك السلام يا قرة عيني وثمرة فؤادي فقال يا أمه إني أشم إنك رائحتان طيبتان كأنها رائحة جدي رسول الله صلى الله عليه وآله فقلت نعم إن جدك تحت الكساء فأقبل الحسن نحو الكساء وقال السلام عليك يا جداه أتأذن لي أن أدخل معك تحت الكساء قال وعليك السلام يا ولدي ويا صاحب حوضي قد أذنت لك فدخل معه تحت الكساء فما كانت إلا ساعة وإذا بولد الحسين قد أقبل وقال السلام عليك يا أمه فقلت وعليك السلام يا ولدي ويا قرة عيني وثمرة فؤادي فقال لي يا أمه إني أشم إنك رائحتان طيبتان كأنها رائحة جدي رسول الله صلى الله عليه وآله فقلت نعم إن جدك وأخاك تحت الكساء فدنا الحسين نحو الكساء وقال السلام عليك يا جداه السلام عليك يا من اختار الله أتأذن لي أن أدخل معكما تحت الكساء فقال وعليك السلام يا ولدي ويا شافي أمتي قد أذنت لك فدخل معهما تحت الكساء فأقبل عند ذلك أبو الحسن علي بن أبي طالب وقال السلام عليك يا بنت رسول الله فقلت وعليك السلام يا أبا الحسن ويا أمير المؤمنين فقال يا فاطمة إني أشم إنك رائحتان طيبتان كأنها رائحة أخي وابن عمي رسول الله فقلت نعم ها هو مع ولديك تحت الكساء فأقبل علي نحو الكساء وقال السلام عليك يا رسول الله أتأذن لي أن أكون معكم تحت الكساء قال له وعليك السلام يا أخي ويا وسي وخليفتي وصاحب لوائي قد أذنت لك فدخل علي تحت الكساء ثم أتيت نحو الكساء وقلت السلام عليك يا أبتا يا رسول الله أتأذن لي أن أكون معكم تحت الكساء؟ قال وعليك السلام يا بنتي ويا بدعتي، قد أذنت لك. فدخلت تحت الكساء. فلما اكتملنا جميعا تحت الكساء، أخذ أبي رسول الله بطرف الكساء وأومأ بيده اليمنى إلى السماء وقال: اللهم إن هؤلاء أهل بيتي وخاصتي وحامتي، لحمهم لحمي ودمهم دمي، يؤلمني ما يؤلمهم ويحزنني ما يحزنهم. أنا حرب لمن حاربهم، وسلم لمن سالمهم، وعدو لمن عاداهم، ومحب لمن أحبهم. إنهم مني وأنا منهم. فاجعل صلواتك وبركاتك ورحمتك وغفرانك ورضوانك علي وعليهم، وأذهب عنهم الرجس وطهرهم تطهيرا. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. فقال الله عز وجل: يا ملائكتي ويا سكان سماواتي، إني ما خلقت سماء مبنية ولا أرضا مدهية ولا قمرا منيرا ولا شمسا مضيعا ولا فلكا يدور ولا بحرا يجري ولا فلكا يسري، إلا في محبة هؤلاء الخمسة الذين هم تحت الكساء. فقال الأمين جبرائيل: يا ربي ومن تحت الكساء؟ فقال عز وجل: هم أهل بيت النبوة ومعدن الرسالة، هم فاطمة وأبوها وبعلها وبنوها. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. فقال جبرائيل: يا ربي يتأذن لي أن أهبط إلى الأرض ليكون معهم سادسا. فقال الله: نعم، قد أذنت لك. فهبط الأمين جبرائيل وقال: السلام عليك يا رسول الله. العلي الأعلى يقرئك السلام ويخصك بالتحية والإكرام، ويقول لك: وعزتي وجلالي إني ما خلقت سماء مبنية ولا أرضا مدهية ولا قمرا منيرا ولا شمسا مضيعا ولا فلكا يدور ولا بحرا يجري ولا فلكا يسري، إلا لأجلكم ومحبتكم، وقد أذن لي أن أدخل معكم، فهل تأذن لي يا رسول الله؟ فقال رسول الله: وعليك السلام يا أمين وحي الله، فإنه نعم قد أذنت لك. فدخل جبرائيل معنا تحت الكساء. فقال لأبي: إن الله قد أوحى إليكم يقول: إنما يريد الله ليذهب عنكم الرجس أهل البيت ويطهركم تطهيرا. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. فقال علي لأبي: يا رسول الله، أخبرني ما لجلوسنا هذا تحت الكساء من الفضل عند الله. فقال النبي صلى الله عليه وآله: والذي بعثني بالحق نبيا واستفاني بالرسالة نجيا، ما ذكر خبرنا هذا في محفل من محافل أهل الأرض، وفيه جمع من شيعتنا ومحبينا إلا ونزلت عليهم الرحمة. وحفت بهم الملائكة واستغفرت لهم إلى أن يتفرقوا. فقال علي عليه السلام: إذا والله فذنا وفاز شيعتنا ورب الكعبة. فقال أبي رسول الله صلى الله عليه وآله: يا علي والذي بعثني بالحق نبيا واستفاني بالرسالة نجيا، ما ذكر خبرنا هذا في محفل من محافل أهل الأرض، وفيه جمع من شيعتنا ومحبينا، وفيهم مهموم إلا وفرج الله همه، ولا مغموم إلا وكشف الله غمه، ولا طالب حاجة إلا وقضى الله حاجته. فقال علي عليه السلام: إذا والله فذنا وسعدنا وكذلك شيعتنا، فازوا وسعدوا في الدنيا والآخرة ورب الكعبة. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. سورة المباركة الفاتحة.
سورة المباركة الفاتحة. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ونبينا أبي القاسم محمد، اللهم صل على محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين الصادقين، والذين ذهب الله عنهم الرجس وطهرهم تطهيرا. أما بعد، فقد قال الله في كتابه الكريم: بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله وابتغوا إليه الوسيلة، صدق الله العلي العظيم. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. First and foremost, I want to congratulate you all on this occasion of the birth of Imam Hasan al-Askari alayhi salam. This Imam, of course, was born in Samarra, and he was martyred in Samarra at the age of 28. There are many incidents from his life, many traditions which show his status, which show his piety, and which show his contributions. And many of these traditions you've heard. But tonight, because it was an occasion of the Wiladat of an Imam, and I want to apologize for the less than optimal screen quality at the moment. We had to take some backup measures in terms of the recording. So on this occasion of the Wiladat of the Imam, because we seek to hold these gatherings, and we find it important that we have these gatherings where we gather to remember the Imam and to remember these different occasions of Wilada and Shahada. A topic which is associated with this Imam, or rather any of the Imams, is the discussion of wasila or tawassul, or taking intermediaries towards Allah. I know this discussion is something which is being discussed a lot currently in these days within different, Shia circles. And it's something which is often discussed when it comes to the realm of intra-faith dialogue between the different sects within the Muslim world. And one can even say that when it comes to the realm of Shia-Sunni dialogue, this discussion may in fact be one of the most contentious discussions, if not the most contentious discussion. Because many people, they'll ask the question that if you as a Muslim believe in the doctrine of Tawheed, or God's oneness, to such an extent that you say that one cannot even in the mind imagine there to be a partner for Allah, or there to be someone close to Allah, then how does it make sense that you place a human being before Allah? That doesn't make sense rationally for you to use Imam Ali alayhi salam as a wasila, or to use Rasulullah as a wasila, or to use Fatimatul Zahra as a wasila, for example. But if I'll rephrase this argument that they make in a more sophisticated manner, they'll say that your relationship with your Imams is the relationship of them being intermediaries before Allah. For example, when we look within the Sunni world and we say somebody, for example, is a follower of Imam al-Malik in fiqh, or he's a follower of Imam al-Shafi'i in fiqh, or Imam Abu Hanifa, or Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal, that relationship they have with their Imams is the relationship of a student to a teacher, a relationship of a scholar to somebody who is taking knowledge from them. But when it comes to the school of Ahlul Bayt, other schools will say that you have placed your Imams as intermediaries between you and Allah. And this is something which doesn't make sense, number one, from the angle of rationale. Because Allah within the Quran, for example, in Surah Qaf, in chapter 50, verse 16, He says, وَنَحْنُ أَقْرَبُ إِلَيْهِ مِنْ حَبْلِ الْوَرِيدِ. That Allah says we are closer to them than the jugular vein. Or for example, in Surah Al-Baqarah, chapter 2, verse 186, He'll say, وَإِذَا سَأَلَكَ عِبَادِي عَنِّي فَإِنِّي قَرِيبٌ أُجِيبُ دَعْوَةَ الدَّاعِ إِذَا دَعَانِ. That Allah, He says that when my servants, they ask about me, tell them that I am near and I answer the supplication of the one making dua when he calls upon me. When you look at it rationally, if Allah is closer than the jugular vein and He is saying that He answers the supplication of the supplicants, then it does not rationally make sense for there to be someone between you and Allah. So you find that this is the first type of argument that they'll bring. From the second level, they'll argue that in the way this does not make sense rationally, this is something which contradicts the text of the Quran. Because when you look within the Quran in Surah Az-Zumar, chapter 39, verse 3, Allah within that verse, He describes the mistake of the mushrikun, or those idol worshippers in that time period. And when He describes their mistake, you find that the Quran, it quotes them as saying, in this verse, chapter 39, verse 3, مَا نَعْبُدُهُمْ إِلَّا لِيُقَرِّبُونَ إِلَى اللَّهِ زُلْفَى. That when you ask those individuals that why is it that you worship these idols, they reply by saying that we do not do the ibadah or the worship of these idols except because it brings us closer to Allah. In other words, they recognize that there is an overarching entity known as Allah, and these idols who they're worshiping, they are only intermediaries. So they'll say that your logic, when it comes to placing the Imams as intermediaries between you and Allah, is the same logic that these idolaters, these mushrikun, they used. So you find when individuals have come up with such arguments, it's of the utmost importance that we understand this topic of tawassul with great depth in order that we can appreciate the Imams of Ahlul Bayt, the function of the Imams of Ahlul Bayt, and Imam Hasan al-Askari alayhi salam upon this night. And that's why I'll discuss in the following stages. From the first level, we'll examine this topic of tawassul, or taking intermediaries, from the lens of logic and philosophy. From the second level, we'll look at this discussion from the realm of the ayat and the verses of the Quran. From the third level, we'll examine the hadith and we'll see what forms of tawassul are mentioned within the Quran and the hadith, and which of these forms does the Muslim ummah agree upon, and which of these forms are forms of disagreement. From the next level, we'll examine why did Rasulullah bring his Ahlul Bayt upon the day of Mubahala, and how was this an example of tawassul? And from the final level, we'll examine the important discussion as to why should one engage within the act of tawassul, and what function and importance does it serve? And we'll discuss upon these different levels. Now, when it comes to the crux or the heart of this discussion, you find that when it comes to understanding the concept of tawassul, or taking intermediaries towards Allah, we need to come to the understanding that many tenets within our belief system are proved through the mechanism of rationality or through the intellect. For example, if I said to you that how can you prove the existence of Allah, you're not going to open the Quran and say that the Quran says Allah exists, thus I believe Allah exists. Why? Because this is something which is circular. The Quran has a value because it is the book of Allah. So if you say that the Quran says that Allah exists, then this is something circular. So how do we establish the existence of Allah? We establish the existence of Allah through rationality, through the intellect, through aql. So there are many ideas within Islamic thought which have an intellectual basis. And the question to be asked at this moment is that, is tawassul something we can discuss from the realm of aql and rationale, or is this something which is strictly proven through the textual sources? Now, when it comes to the discussion of tawassul from the angle of aql and rationale, you find that this discussion is related to the discussion about cause and effect. You see, when we look in this world, we find that this world, it functions upon cause and effect. And whenever you have a cause which brings about an effect, you find that there are two things which are necessary. From the first level, you have the muqtadi and that which brings about. And number two, you have the shara'it and the conditions. In other words, I'll explain it with a very simple example. When fire burns something, whether it's a piece of wood or a piece of cloth or anything else, number one, for that burning to occur by fire, over here, the muqtadi, the necessitator, is the fire, because the fire carries out the burning. But at the second level, you find that there is a condition. That condition is that that object has to be close to the fire. If that object is not close to the fire, then you find that this cause and effect of fire burning the object, it wouldn't occur. So this is from the first level. From the second level, when we look within the Quran, we'll find that Allah, He shows within the Quran that He has two different realms. The first realm, which Allah mentions within the Quran, in chapter 7, verse 43, is the realm of Amar, the realm of Allah's command. And number two, He mentions the realm of khalq and creation. For example, in chapter 7, verse 43, He says, Ala lahul khalqu wal amar. That number one, there is the realm of Allah's command. And number two, there is the realm of khalq and creation. Now, how does this relate to that discussion of cause and effect? You see, when it comes to the realm of Allah's command, Over here, there is no intermediaries, there is no wasila, there is no entity which comes as a barrier. The Quran in Surah Yasin, it says, إِنَّمَا أَمْرُهُ إِذَا أَرَادَ شَيْئًا أَن يَقُولَ لَهُ كُن فَيَكُونُ. That when Allah He intends something, He figuratively says to it, be, and it becomes. That's why when you look at the human body, right? The human body is created through intermediaries. For example, yes, we say Allah is the creator. Allah is the muqtadi. But one of the conditions for us to be created is, for example, for man and woman to come together, for the different parts of the body to form. But when it comes to the soul wasn't created through intermediaries. The soul was created by one go by Allah. And that's why when the Quran, it describes the soul, it says, وَيَسْأَلُونَكَ عَنِ الرُّوحِ, that they ask about the soul. قُلِ الرُّوحُ مِنْ أَمْرِ رَبِّي, tell them that the ruh and the spirit is from the amr and the command of Allah. So you find from one level, when it comes to the realm of Allah's command, there are no intermediaries. But when it comes to the realm of khalq and creation, you find that intermediaries are something which is necessary. And I'll give you one example to tie this discussion together. Within the Quran, in Surah Al-Baqarah, in Surah Al-Shu'ara, chapter 26, verse number 32, there is a quotation within that verse from the Prophet Ibrahim. And Nabi Ibrahim within the Quran is quoted to have said, وَإِذَا مَرِضْتُ فَهُوَ يَشْفِينِي, that when I am sick, Allah, He is the one who cures me. Over here, Nabi Ibrahim is saying that Allah is the one who cures, that Allah is the muqtadi, He is the ultimate source which brings about cure. But when we look at the world practically, how does cure come about? When a person is ill, that illness doesn't magically go away. Number one, God made a material means or a material wasila. And that material means or wasila is that you take medicine, that this medicine is an intermediary for Allah to cure you. Now, there's no one in the Muslim world who says that it is a bid'ah, it is an innovation, it is haram to take medicine. Because this idea, wasila or intermediaries working, is something which is very natural. It's something which works within the realm. If, for example, if there is bread which comes upon my table, yes, I recognize Allah is the one who gave us this food. Allah is the one who is the provider. But there were intermediaries. You find that grain was placed in the ground and it grew, and there was an individual who processed it. Then there was an individual who shipped it out. Then there was an individual who cooked it. And all of those processes, it ends at my table. So within this first level, you find there are material means. But at the second level, you find that there are spiritual means as well, and there are spiritual wasayat, there are spiritual intermediaries. So in that example, Nabi Ibrahim said, وَإِذَا مَرِضْتُ فَهُوَ يَشْفِينِي, that when I'm sick, Allah cures me. One material means was medicine. But at the second level, another means of cure are spiritual actions. That's why, for example, Rasulullah in a hadith says, Inna sadaqa tadfa'ul bala. That sadaqah is something which keeps harm away. Or Imam Sadiq would say, tasaddaqu wadawu mardakum bis sadaqah. Imam Sadiq in a different tradition says that give sadaqah and cure your ill individuals by the giving of the sadaqah or by the giving of charity. So you find that over here, we see that charity has an impact as an intermediary or a means to cure. So in other words, when it comes to the next stage of this discussion, when people, they say that Allah is closer than the jugular vein, then why is it that one needs an intermediary before Allah? When one says this line, there is one major philosophical supposition or mistake they're making. You see, that mistake is that they assume that Allah being close to us is the same as us being close to Allah. And you'll have to bear with me on this idea because it's something which is counterintuitive, and you'll have to bear with me because listening and lecturing on Zoom is something which is not ideal and is quite difficult at times as well. But if there is whatever object you're watching this lecture on, whether it's your TV or laptop, if that TV or laptop is 5 feet from you, then you are 5 feet from it. The distance of that object from you is the same as the distance of you from that object. So over here, one would assume that Allah being close to us is the same as us being close to Allah, but that isn't the case. Because whenever you look at the verses of the Quran, the ayat of the Quran say that Allah is close to you. The verses of the Quran do not say necessarily that you are close to Allah. For example, وَنَحْنُ أَقْرَبُ إِلَيْهِ مِنْ حَبْلِ الْوَرِيدِ, that we are closer to him than the jugular vein. You see, what we understand from this is that there are two types of closeness. Number one is al-qurbul waqi'i, something which is a real closeness. No matter what you do within your life, no matter what mistake you make, Allah is always closer than the jugular vein. You see, Allah, there is no change in Allah. Whenever a relationship between two people, it changes. Either it's because party A is changing, or party B is changing, or both of them are changing. But the essence of God isn't described by change. So if our relationship with Allah is suffering, then it's because we have distanced ourselves. But He is the one who remains close at every moment. And if we are the ones who have distanced ourselves from Allah, then there has to be intermediaries or means or mediums which are closer to Allah, which take us back towards Allah. That's why when you look at the Quran, you'll find that there are many different things within the Quran which have been mentioned as an intermediary towards Allah. For example, the Quran says in chapter number 2, verse 125, it says, وَاتَّخِذُوا مِن مَقَامِ إِبْرَاهِيمَ مُصَلًّى. The Quran in this chapter says, O human being, the maqam of Nabi Ibrahim, when you go towards Hajj, this maqam, this spot in Mecca, take this spot as a spot of prayer. I say, oh Allah, as long as the land is not usurped and the conditions of jurisprudence are met, I can pray anywhere. But why are you telling me to pray at that spot, the maqam of Prophet Ibrahim? It is because that spot is a spatial wasila. That spot is a means of closeness to Allah in terms of locality, in terms of an area upon this earth. So if we within our hadith have the concept that the one who has done the ziyarah of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam is like the one who has done the ziyarah of Allah metaphorically, or that has this type of reward that his du'as are accepted, then this is something which doesn't contradict the Quran, because the Quran in this ayat is showing that there are certain places upon this earth which have a spiritual potency, and you need to hold on to those spaces in order that you can build that connection with Allah. For example, one of the values of a masjid, along the side of having a community, along the side of people gathering and assisting and supporting one another, is because once you have dedicated that spot to the worship of Allah, that spot has a spiritual potency to bring you closer towards Allah. So you find this is the first example of wasila within the Quran. Another example we find of wasila within the Quran is that the Quran, it shows that there are certain times which are times of closeness to Allah as well. And in that manner, a time period can be a wasila or an intermediary to bring you closer towards Allah. For example, the Quran in chapter 97, Surah Al-Qadr, it says, Inna anzalnahu fi laylatil qadr wa ma adraka ma laylatul qadr. Laylatul qadri khayrum min alfi shahr. The Quran in this chapter, when it describes the night of Qadr, it says that the night of Qadr is greater than 1,000 months. In other words, this time period is a time where one can use it as an intermediary, that it has a special potency of taking you towards Allah. And there's many different times in our lives when this potency it occurs. That's why it's stated that when the heart, it feels khushu, it feels that sorrow or submissiveness to Allah, or that openness, then these spots are blessing times or blessings from Allah, and one should make the most of them. So you find this is another example of wasila from the Quran. From the third level, we find that an action can be a wasila as well. That when you carry out an action, this is an intermediary to bring you closer towards Allah. The Quran in chapter 2, verse 45, it says, وَاسْتَعِنُوا بِالصَّبْرِ وَالصَّلَاةِ, that, O human being, when you seek help through patience and through prayer. That prayer, in the sense, is a wasila or intermediary. So you find this is another example. Another example of wasila, and to recap very quickly, the first example is that the Quran mentions a location can be an intermediary. The Quran mentions that a time period can be an intermediary. The Quran mentions that an action can be an intermediary. And then the Quran mentions even an object can be an intermediary. When you look in the Quran in Surah Yusuf, chapter 12, verse number 93, the Quran, it mentions that the Prophet Yaqub, after his son Yusuf was separated from him, the Prophet Yaqub cried so much that he became blind. وَبِيَضَّتْ عَيْنَاهُ مِنَ الْحُزُنِ. The Quran says this. So you find that once the brothers, after they go through their journey, and I don't want to get into too much detail on this story because of the time it'll take, the brothers of Yusuf, eventually, after Yusuf is thrown in the well, he becomes the economic minister. When he's the economic minister, the brothers, they go there, they tell Yusuf about their father. And Yusuf over here in chapter 12, verse 93, he does something interesting. He doesn't say that, tell my father to go and make dua to Allah. What he says is, idhabu bi qamisi hada fa'alquhu ala wajhi abi ya'ti basira. Chapter 12, verse 93. That take this shirt of mine to my father and place this upon his face, and his vision will come back. His blindness will be cured. In other words, Nabi Yaqub, Nabi Yusuf over here is showing that when an object has a nisbah and a connection with the Prophet, then even an object can be an intermediary towards Allah carrying out his command. So you find that there are many examples within the Quran of an intermediary. For example, a few verses later in chapter 12, verse 97 and 98, when the brothers of Yusuf, they recognize their mistake, they say to their father, Ya Abana, istaghfir lana dhunubana inna kunna khati'in, that ask Allah to forgive our sins because we are amongst those who had made a mistake. Nabi Yaqub then says, Sofa astaghfiru lakum rabbi, I'll make dua for you. The Quran over here, these brothers of Yusuf, they could have asked Allah directly, but why do they go to their father? Because they recognize their father is a prophet of God, their father is a believer, their father is a holy individual, and his dua can have more potency than our own dua, thus we'll ask him to make dua. And when you look at all of these ayat and all of these verses of the Quran, you find the clearest verse which demonstrates the concept of tawassul, or taking an intermediary, is Surah Al-Ma'idah, chapter 5, verse 35. And that is the verse which I mentioned at the beginning of this lecture. That verse, it says, Ya ayyuhalladina amanu ittaqullah wabtagu ilayhi al-wasila. That, oh, you who believe, number one, have taqwa, be God conscious, and number two, take an intermediary towards Allah. You know, some said that this intermediary in this ayah, it is amalu saleh and it is righteous actions. I say to those individuals who interpret the Quran in this manner that yes, without a doubt, amalu saleh is one of those intermediaries. But if Allah wanted it to mean that exclusively, then He would have said that. But Allah specifically uses the word wasila. So if Allah is using the word wasila in this ayah, and this ayah is unrestricted, then it's upon us to go towards the Quran and to go towards the hadith and see what examples of wasila are mentioned within the Quran and the hadith. And when we examine these forms, you'll see some of these forms the Muslim Ummah agrees upon, and some of these forms are points of contention within the Muslim Ummah. For example, the first form of wasila mentioned within the amongst the different types of wasila is to take the names of Allah as an intermediary. The Quran says, وَلِلَّهِ الْأَسْمَاءُ الْحُسْنَى فَادْعُوهُ بِهَا. That Allah has the best of names and call Him by these names. That's why both within the Shia world and the non-Shia world, we find many du'as where people, they make du'a by the names of Allah. For example, in Dua Joshan al-Kabir, we say, Allahumma inni asaluka bismika ya Allahu ya Rahmanu ya Rahimu ya Muqimu ya Kareem. That, oh Allah, I ask you by the rights of your name that you are, oh Allah, and you are the beneficent, and you are the merciful, and you are the generous. In this manner, we find even, for example, in Sahih, in the Sunan of At-Tirmidhi, within the Sunni world, there is du'as, for example, where they'll say, Allahumma inni as'aluka بأنت الله الذي لم يلد ولم يولد ولم يكن له كفوا أحد. For example, they'll say, we ask by the right of you being Allah, the one who does not beget nor is He begotten, and everything depends on Him, He depends on nothing else. And in this manner, you find everyone in the Muslim world recognizes that the names of Allah can be a wasila. Number two, we find that the second type of wasila is that the Quran can be a wasila. On the night of Qadr, we have a dua where we open the Quran and we say, Allahumma inni as'aluka bi kitabika al-munzal wa ma fihi wa fihi ismuka al-akbar wa asma'uka al-husna. That, oh Allah, we ask through the right of the Quran that when we want something from Allah, we place the Quran in between us and Allah. And if only there was a group which was put alongside the Quran, we could take them as well. So you find that the Quran is an intermediary. We find this concept is even within the Sunni world as well. In Sahih al-Muslim, the narrator Imran ibn al-Husayn, he says that I heard the Prophet of God say, Iqra'ul Quran was'alullaha tabarak wa ta'ala bihi قبل أن يجي قوما يسألون به الناس. That read the Quran and ask Allah by the right of the Quran before a group of individuals comes who ask the people by the Quran. So you find when it comes to the first form of tawassul, which is the names of Allah, asking by the names of Allah, and the second type, asking by the Quran, the entire Muslim Ummah agrees upon this. The third type of tawassul, and as we go through these different forms of tawassul and I wrap up my lecture, is that a righteous action can be an intermediary before Allah. You know, the Quran, when it mentions Nabi Ibrahim, and when he builds the Kaaba, Nabi Ibrahim says, وَإِذْ يَرْفَعُ إِبْرَاهِيمُ الْقَوَائِدَ مِنْ الْبَيْتِ وَإِسْمَاعِيلَ رَبَّنَا تَقَبَّلْ مِنَّا إِنَّكَ أَنْتَ السَّمِيعُ الْعَلِيمُ. That the Quran mentions that after Nabi Ibrahim and Nabi Ismail, they set the foundation for the Kaaba. At that point, they made a dua and they say, oh Allah, accept this from us. In other words, and this verse is indicating, although not directly, that after you perform a good action, then you should ask Allah. That's why oftentimes in these gatherings where we remember Ahlul Bayt, whether it's majalis or these occasions of wilada, after the gathering, why do we make dua? We make dua because we have carried out an action of purity. We have carried out an action which pleases Allah. Then after that, we are asking Allah. We even find, for example, in Sahih al-Bukhari, it mentions that in the incident of the people of the cave, it says that these people of the cave over there, when they were leaving, that there was a rock which was blocking them. So they said, oh Allah, each of us would carry out an action, and through the right of that action, we ask you to move this rock, and the rock, it began to move. So you find this is another example of wasila. After that, the next example of wasila, the fourth example, is asking a believer to make dua. And this is something which is agreed upon and something which is evident within our du'as, within the Quran. There are many examples in the Quran where people, they ask dua for other individuals. For example, Rabbina ighfir lana wa li ikhwanina, that, oh Allah, forgive us and forgive our brethren. But after going through all of these different examples, you find that the question it comes, that up to this point, everyone agrees, that the entire Muslim Ummah agrees that you can ask somebody else to make dua, or you can make dua by a righteous action, or you can make dua by the names of Allah. The issue that comes up is that can you benefit from the dua of an individual? Or can you benefit by asking Allah through the right of an individual after they have passed away? And this is where there are many points of contention which begin to come up. Now, the first thing you need to understand is that a person who is pious, even after they pass away from this world, you find that there is a connection between them and within this world. That's why when you look in the Quran in chapter 3, verse 69, verse 70, it says, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. وَلَا تَحْسَبَنَّ الَّذِينَ قُتِلُوا فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ أَمْوَاتًا بَلْ أَحْيَاءٌ عِنْدَ رَبِّهِمْ يُرْزَقُونَ. It says, do not suppose that those who are slain in the way of Allah are dead, but rather they are alive and they are receiving sustenance from their Lord. Then after that, the verse it continues. فَرِحِينَ بِمَا آتَاهُمُ اللَّهُ مِنْ فَضْلِهِ. They are in rejoice out of what they are in happiness out of what Allah has given out of His grace. وَيَسْتَبْشِرُونَ بِالَّذِينَ لَمْ يَلْحَقُوا بِهِمْ مِنْ خَلْفِهِمْ. And they rejoice for those who have not yet joined them and those who they have left behind. In other words, this verse is showing that these individuals killed in the way of Allah, they are rejoicing for those individuals who will later join them because they're on the path of truth. In other words, even after passing away, they have a recognition of those who are upon this earth. And I'll give you another example in Surah Yasin, chapter 36, when it mentions the story of Habib al-Najjar, an individual who supported the prophets. It said, that enter paradise. After Habib al-Najjar enters paradise, according to the Quran, he says, Ya layta qawmi ya'lamun bima ghafara li rabbi wa ja'alani min al-mukrameen. That if only my people knew what Allah has given to me in terms of forgiveness and what honor He has given me. So you find that this verse is showing that those who have passed away have a recognition of those upon this earth. That's why when you look in Sahih al-Bukhari, even after the death of Rasulullah, it is quoted that Abu Bakr goes to the grave of Rasulullah and he says, Ya Rasulullah, la yajma'ullahu lakal mawtataini, that may you not die 2 times. That from the earliest time period, people would go to the grave of the Prophet and they would address them directly by saying, Ya Rasulullah, Amir al-Mu'mineen in Nahj al-Balagha, he says, Ya Rasulallah, udqurna in the qabrik, in the rabbik. That the Nahj al-Balagha is saying that as Imam Ali alayhi salam is by the grave of Rasulullah, he says, Ya Rasulallah, remember us by your Lord. So when certain individuals say that you cannot ask the Rasulullah directly, you cannot say Ya Rasulallah, taking him as an intermediary, this is against the way of Amir al-Mu'mineen. This is against the way of the companions of Rasulullah. We have many examples within our du'as where we ask through the right of these individuals. And rather than that, we ask through the right of even the mu'mineen in many du'as. For example, in the du'a on the commencement of on the finishing of Shahr Ramadan, there is a du'a of Imam Zainul Abidin where Imam Zainul Abidin in As-Sahifatu Sajjadiyah, he says, Allahumma inni as'aluka bihaqqi hadha ash-shahr wa man ta'abbada fihi. That, oh Allah, I ask through the right of this month and those who do ibadat within this month. And this is something which the entire Muslim Ummah finds examples in their works that people would ask through the right of others. There's an example in the Sunan of Ibn Majah that Rasulullah has a dua where he says, Allahumma inni asaluka bihaqqi as-sa'ilina alayk. That I ask through the right of those who ask from you, O Allah. And to summarize this entire discussion, one example in the seerah of Rasulullah, where Rasulullah used an intermediary, is the day of Mubahala. On the day of Mubahala, when the verse says, فَقُلْ تَعَالَوْ نَدْعُوا أَبْنَاءَنَا وَأَبْنَاءَكُمْ وَنِسَاءَنَا وَنِسَاءَكُمْ, that the verse, it says that when the Christians of Najran, they come and they have their discussion and there's no agreement which is reached, Rasulullah says we'll engage in a Mubahala. Each of us as Muslims, we accept that the dua of Rasulullah is accepted by Allah. That Rasulullah, if he indicated to the moon, you find the moon, it would split. But when Rasulullah comes upon that day, he doesn't just make a dua to stop the Christians of Najran. When Rasulullah, he comes, in his hand is Imam al-Hussein, holding the hand of Imam al-Hasan. Behind him is Janab al-Zahra. Behind her is Amir al-Mu'mineen. In other words, Rasulullah, after that, he says, وَإِذَا دَعُوتُ فَأَمِّنُوا, that when I make dua, you say Ameen. Rasulullah's dua would have been accepted without Ahlul Bayt saying Ameen towards Rasulullah's dua. But what the Prophet of God is showing is that I, Muhammad, who need no wasila towards Allah, if I am using an intermediary, then it is my progeny, it is my Ahlul Bayt who are my intermediaries. That's why one reason for wasila and to use them as an intermediary is to understand their status. It is to build an emotional connection with them. That's why we gather and we have the recitation of qasida and poetry upon these occasions. We gather, we listen to the stories of Imam Hasan al-Askari and the Imams of Ahlul Bayt. For example, when an individual was refuting Islam and saying that the Quran has contradictions, and he wrote a book called At-Tanaqud fil Quran, the contradictions of the Quran, Imam al-Askari sends one of his students, and he says, ask that individual one question, that is it possible is it possible that the one who wrote the Quran intended something that what you understand from it? And you find that man, he recognizes his mistake and you find he turns away from that. Or when we hear about the character of Imam Hasan al-Askari, that when Imam al-Askari, he spends his time of his imamat under house arrest and the majority of his life in house arrest, you find that they would give the imam cold water and 2 loaves of bread. Then one day, one of his followers brings 5 pomegranates for the imam. And that guard who is making the life of the Imam difficult, the Imam gives one pomegranate to him. And then he sees that that guard doesn't eat the pomegranate. The Imam says, why is it that you don't eat from it? He says that I have a family, so the Imam gives all 5 towards him. That Imam would eat 2 loaves of bread. He gave that to an individual who was the one who was arresting his house. So you find that taking these days as intermediaries before Allah and taking these individuals as intermediaries is something which strengthens our connection with Allah. And it's something which brings us closer to Him. And with that said, we say, oh Allah, we ask you the right of Muhammad and Ali Muhammad. Wherever the followers of Ahlul Bayt are in difficulty, help them. Wherever they're sickening, and cure them. And we pray for the hastening of the reappearance of the master of our time. رَبَّنَا تَقَبَّلْ مِنَّا إِنَّكَ أَنْتَ السَّمِيعُ الْعَلِيمُ.
Unmuted. Hasan, Jazakallah, Sheikh Bilal. May Allah reward you for a wonderful speech in reference to tawassul, much needed subject for today. Afzalus Salam Muhammad Salawat Salu ala Muhammad Ali walo Mubarak Markaze ایمان آیا ہے حسن آئے ہے یا اسلام کا علی والو مبارک نبی کے دل پہ جو اترا وہ نبی کے دل پہ جو اترا ہے وہ قرآن صامت ہے نکی کے گھر میں آج بولتا قرآن آیا ہے علی والو مبارک محافظ دین کا اور ہے لقب اصغری جس کا زمین اور ہے فلک میں آج جشن عسکری برپا علی والو مبارک افضل السلام محمد صلو علی محمد لگاؤ حیدری نعرہ علی کی محفل ہے ہر ایک غم کو بھلا دو خوشی کی محفل ہے فلک کے چاند ستاروں اتر کے آ جاؤ فلک کے چاند ستاروں اتر کے آ جاؤ زمیں پہ آج حسن اصغری کی محفل ہے صلوات افضل محمد وآل محمد صلو علی محمد ہوئے عسکری آج پیدا مبارک مبارک امام زمانہ مبارک ہوئے عسکری نبی کا ہوا آج روشن گھرانہ ہے دل شاد خیر ورا کا مبارک محمد تقی کو یہ پوتا مبارک نکی کو یہ بے مثل بیٹا مبارک ہوئے عسکری آج پیدا زمانہ مبارک ہوئے عسکری قرآن نہیں اطرت سے جدا فرما گئے ہے محبوب خدا جو ٹوٹے نہ روز محشر تک ان دونوں کا رشتہ قائم ہے یا امام زمانہ کرم کیجئے یا امام کرم کیجئے یا امام زمانہ کرم کیجئے نور آنکھوں کا میری بڑھا دیجئے یا امام زمانہ کرم کیجئے یا امام زمانہ کرم کیجئے غیر کے در پہ کیوں جائیں فریاد کو غیر کے در پہ کیوں جائیں فریاد کو آپ سر پر سلامت ہے امداد کو ہم غریبوں کی حاجت کیجئے یا امام زمانہ کرم کیجئے امام کرم کیجئے سر اٹھا یا سپاہ یزیدی میں پھر سر اٹھا یا سپاہ یزیدی نے پھر ہم ہے اہل ولا آپ کے منتظر آپ کے نسل یزیدی مٹا دیجئے یا امام زمانہ کرم کیجئے یا امام زمانہ کرم کیجئے جس گھڑی آپ کی عید ہو جائے جس گھڑی آپ کی عید ہو در حقیقت میری ہو جائے گی زندگی میں وہ دن بھی دکھا دیجئے یا امام زمانہ نہ کرم کیجیے
یا امام
زمان نہ کرم کیجیے. ہے حسن آپ کا ایک ادنا غلام دے رہا ہے صدا آپ کو صبح و شام. ورثہ میرا بنا دیجیے یا امام میں زمانہ کرم کیجیے یا امام میں زمانہ کرم کیجیے. افضل الصلاۃ والسلام یا رسول اللہ صلوات علی الہی ببیمار دشت بلا جو بیمار ہو پائے شفا. الہی برائے امام زمان ہمیں حول محشر سے دے تو امان. تو مشہور رہو بالی اٹھے قبر سے کہتے ہم یا علی. ہے 5 و 9 مل شہادتان احمد و علی زہرا و حسن. شبیر سے امام زمان شبیر سے لے تا امام زمان ہر ایک پہ صدا صلوات پڑھو. صلوات کے اس پہ نسائے گوہر جو نبی ہے بلند ہر صفات ہوئے. صلوات و سلام یا امام زمان فرماؤ ظہور یا امام زمان صلوات. السلام علیکم یا رسول اللہ. السلام علیکم یا امیر المؤمنین. السلام علیکم یا فاطمة الزہراء سیدتی نساء العالمین. السلام علیکم یا حسن المجتبی. السلام علیکم یا ابا عبد اللہ وعلى الارواح التي حلت بفنائك. عليك مني جميعا سلام الله أبدا ما بقيت وبقي الليل والنهار ولا جعل الله آخر العهد مني لزيارتكم. السلام على الحسين وعلى علي بن الحسين وعلى أولاد الحسين جميعا ورحمة الله وبركاته. السلام عليك يا 9 المعصومين من ذريتي علي بن الحسين ومحمد بن علي وجعفر بن محمد وموسى بن جعفر وعلي بن موسى ومحمد بن علي ومحمد. السلام عليك يا مولانا يا صاحب العصر والزمان अस्सलामु अलैका या खलीफतुर रहमान, अस्सलामु अलैका या शरीकल कुरान, अस्सलामु अलैका या काबतल ईमान, अस्सलामु अलैकुम जमीअन व रहमतुल्लाहि व बरकातुहू।